An odd sound, Frid. Because I'm an actor, I suppose, I've always tended to hear it as strangers might hear it. Many, hearing the name for the first time, think I'm leaving something out. There's something missing. Frid what? They think maybe it's a prefix like Van or Von or Fitz. But Frid it is. No cadence, no melody. Just Frid. Well, at least you wouldn't think that anyone would have difficulty pronouncing it. But I've heard everything. Fred, Fried, Frit, Frood, Fried, and even Freud. Well, when I was back in England some years ago, I found that the British had as much trouble pronouncing Frid as Canadians and Americans. And so I got the brilliant idea of changing the spelling to F-R-I-D-D. That definitive extra D certainly seemed to do the trick. I began to use this while in repertory in Kent and the south of England. But my triumph was short-lived. You see, I had forgotten that my grandfather, Frid, had been born in Kent almost a century earlier, until some visitors to the theater came up to me one night and announced that they were relatives. Well, they had guessed at our connection from my bio notes in the program. We talked briefly and discussed that extra D a little. My father, back in Canada, was mildly amused by this chance meeting of distant cousins from the old world, but not so amused by my new spelling of his name. I think he was ready to disown me on the spot. No la-di-da F-R-I-D-D spelling of our name, he wrote back. So back to F-R-I-D it went, mispronunciations and all. This obsession with the sound and the genealogy of the Frid name had its genesis, of course, in my adolescent imaginings. I began pestering my father about it. Oh, he would chuckle at me patronizingly. What do you care about all that stuff for? You see, my father, as many of you know, and his father before him came from that breed of self-made men who always looked ahead and not caring a damn really about ancestry. What little he could tell me, however, was that in 1860 my grandfather and his brothers came from Raynham, Kent, in the south of England, settled in Hamilton, Ontario, and established roots there in bricks, the Frid brothers' brickyards. Now, this indifference to family trees was much the same on at least one side of my mother's family. Her father, John McGregor, one of those legendary rural horse and buggy doctors at the turn of the century, made little mention of his family to his children, although it was far from dull, as it turns out. But his wife, Liza, was very much into her lineage. Liza had been born a Mackenzie. Very proud was she of the Mackenzie connections. I myself have heard tell that Liza was not too pleased at first about her daughter Flora becoming engaged back in 1917 to Herb Frid. Just who was he, went out the whispers from the Imperial Gingerbread Palace in Waterdown, Ontario. Isn't he one of the brick people from Hamilton? Meanwhile, back to the dark void of the Frid roots. A casual genealogical exploration was begun about a year ago at the New York Public Library by a friend and colleague of ours, Nancy Kersey. Well, straight off, she found some startling revelations. Here's one of them. In a genealogical study entitled Surnames of the Fossils of Speech, compiled by Samuel L. Brown, we find under the listing Frid on page 111 these items. 1, Frid, Old English, Frid or Frith, meaning a refuge or haven. 2, Old English Frith, F-R-Y-T-H-E, a woods or forest. 3, descendant of Frido. Sounds like a potato chip. But it's an old High German personal name meaning peace. I rather like that. Then, in a dictionary of British surnames edited by Percy Hildy Rennie, published in London and Boston by Routledge and K. Paul Company, there appears on page 120 the following item, which describes the various common forms of this name in the 11th century. It begins under the heading Firth, which leads to Frith, F-R-I-T-H, Frid, F-R-I-D, and Frid, F-R-I-D-D. It would seem that some poor luckless Dane or Angle or Celt back in the millennium ago was fit to be tied just like me, listening to the mispronunciation of his name, and changed it to F-R-I-D-D. And we have no source that says that his dad chopped off his head. Next, Frid, F-R-Y-D. Well, that's quite elegant, but that could be pronounced fried. Anyway, I don't suppose the old man would have gone for that either. So, Freed, Freed, Vreed, V-R-E-D-E, Brift, Burke, Burks, Thrift, Freak, and there are 3 versions. F-R-E-A-K, F-R-E-A-K-E, and F-R-E-K-E. 3 branches of the freaks. Wait a minute. Fright, F-R-I-G-H-T, especially in Kent, where the surname is common. And so it would seem that in County Kent, the Frids first settled as Frights. Well, I guess I've come by my reputation honestly. I suppose it was that discovery that urged our Miss Kersey into going beyond the bounds of conventional research, for she ended up finding the word Frid listed on page 182 of an encyclopedia of fairies, hobgoblins, brownies, bogies, and other supernatural creatures, edited by Catherine Briggs in 1976. Ms. Briggs describes a Frid as a supernatural creature which lives under the rocks in the highlands and which devours all milk or crumbs spilled on the ground. Ms. Briggs goes on to quote one of her sources, a Donald Mackenzie, who wrote about the habits of these Frid creatures in his study of Scottish folklore and folklife, published in London, 1935, which details on page 244 that it is likely that the Fridean, so that's what they called our tribe, it is likely that the Fridean were the original beings to which the libations of milk were poured upon the hills of Gairloch, Ross, and Cromarty. The fairly widespread tale of a piper who, followed by his dog, explored the windings of an underground cavern and never returned from it, is related to the Fridean. The dog returned hairless, as dogs do from encounters with fairies, and died when it came out in the open. Now, just who was this Donald Mackenzie? I'll bet you one hairless dog that guy was related to Liza, knew her well, was in cahoots with her, and egged her on to object to this match of her daughter Flora to Herb Frid. No member of their family was going to marry not only a brickman, but one who lived under rocks. Oh no, from ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go poop in the night, dear Lord, deliver us. However, love conquered all. Herb got to marry Flora, and here I am to tell the tale. Meanwhile, the Fridean tribe is still very much alive and well in Hamilton, Ontario. Their roots and bricks and rocks now lost in legend. Thank you.